Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. A very warm welcome both to those watching us live and to those in the future who will be watching us back. My name is John Astbury. I'm an assistant curator at the Barbican in London, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this event, Noguchi Conversations, Collaborations and Partnerships. This In Conversation event is the second of two events, both of which were inspired by Isamu Noguchi's many collaborations and partnerships, be they personal, professional, some kind of mix of the two, all of which hugely influenced both his outlook and work across sculpture, theatre sets, playgrounds, landscapes, furniture, lighting, and more. The previous event, which was focusing on friendship and community, took place on Monday evening, but this is already available to be watched back on the Barbican's YouTube channel if you want to revisit that one after this. As well as marking, sadly, the end of the run of the exhibition Noguchi at the Barbican in London, which closes on the 23rd of January, this Sunday, these conversations also bring to a close the digital research residency Noguchi Resonances, which has accompanied the exhibition's run. Both these events and this digital research residency were curated by Annie Yale Kwan, who over the last 4 months has been a wonderful collaborator, bringing together an incredible network of artists, curators, and thinkers, all of who have taken part in this reflection on Noguchi's legacy through the creation of letters, podcasts, and audio essays. Again, all of this can be found on the Barbican's website. I'd also like to take the opportunity just to thank both the Terra Foundation for American Art and the US Embassy in London, who have helped both the exhibition and the digital residency and this program of events be possible. While this residency and these events as part of it were prompted by a particular moment in time and the Noguchi exhibition, they've drawn on many ideas that Annie has been working with over the years. And I hope that the residency has acted both to strengthen existing collaborations and instigate some new ones along the way. So to introduce Annie, who will be moderating today's event, Annie is an independent curator and researcher whose work is located at the intersection of contemporary art, art history, and cultural activism, with a particular interest in archives, feminist, queer, and alternative knowledges, collective practices, and solidarity. Annie is a director of Something Human, a curatorial initiative that launched the pioneering Southeast Asia Performance Collection. And she then co-curated the Archive in Residence exhibition of this collection at the Haus der Kunst in Munich in 2019, and has recently been a curator in residence at FACT Liverpool, where she curated the recent exhibition Future Ages Will Wonder. Annie leads Asia Art Activism, or AAA, an interdisciplinary, intergenerational research network exploring the entanglements between Asia, art, and activism. And she's also the instigating council member of Asia Forum. She's a recipient of a Diverse Actions Leadership Award, teaches critical studies at Central St Martin's in London, and writing and curating at Cask School of Art in Ghent. That is just some of an incredibly impressive CV that we have shortened here for brevity. Today, Annie will be in conversation with curators and researchers Alex Chang and John Tain, who are very kindly joining us from the United States and Hong Kong, respectively. It's very early for one of them and very late for the other, and lunchtime for anyone here in the UK. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Annie, who is going to say a little bit more about today and introduce both our speakers in a little more detail. Thank you very much and enjoy. Over to you, Annie.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, John, for that very kind and generous introduction. And I really want to thank the Barbican again for hosting this experimental residency project. It's been such a pleasure to delve into the archive and learn so much more about Noguchi and what he did across so many countries and working with so many people. And it's been one of those projects that also gave me the opportunity to connect and reconnect with collaborators and friends across the world. So, it's been one of those that really kind of expands your mind and heart at the same time. So it's been really a pleasure. So thank you to the Barbican for supporting this. So, as John mentioned, on Monday, I had the privilege to be in conversation with Adriel Lewis and Viet Le to reflect on what friendship and community means to us, especially after our experiences of the pandemic and the challenges that sort of ensued across the last couple of years. So via that conversation, we also began to outline some of the historical and ongoing relational dynamics at work while engaging with transnational practices and solidarity. So today is a real pleasure to introduce two curator researchers that I've had the pleasure to work with to continue that train of thought into thinking about transnational collaborations and partnerships and how we navigate the productive and yet challenging spaces these might encounter. So first of all, we'll have Alexandra Chang, who is Associate Professor of Practice with the Art History program at the Department of Arts, Culture and Media, and Interim Associate Director of the Clement A. Price Institute on Ethnicity, Culture, and the Modern Experience. She's also Associate Director of the American Studies program at Rutgers University, Newark. Pardon me. She also organizes the Eco Art Salon at Paul Robeson Galleries at Run and the Decolonizing Curatorial and Museum Studies and Public Humanities Project. She directs the Global Asia Pacific Art Exchange GACS and the Virtual Asian American Art Museum with APA Institute at NYU. And she's the co-founding editor of Asian Diasporic Visual Cultures and the Americas. She's co-founder of the College Art Association's affiliated society, the Diasporic Asian Art Network. Also here today with me, streaming in from the other side of the time zone, is John Tain, who is head of research at Asia Art Archive, where he leads a team based in Hong Kong, New Delhi, and Shanghai. He has organized several exhibitions, among them Yasuhiro Ishimoto, Someday Chicago in 2018, Out of Turn at the Serendipity Arts Festival in Goa in 2018, and Women Make Art History and the Body Collective during Art Basel Hong Kong in 2018 and 19. And most recently, Crafting Communities in 2020, which looks at the confluence of feminism, crafts, and social practice in the biennial series of War Manifesto events organized in Thailand from 1997 to 2008. In 2019 to 2020, he co-convened Mahasa, which is Modern Art Histories in and across Africa and the South and Southeast Asia, 2019 to 2020, a collaboration with the Dhaka Art Summit and the Institute for Comparative Modernities at Cornell University. His writings have appeared in publications such as Art Forum, Flash Art, and Art Review Asia, and he is an editor for the Exhibition History series with After All, CCS Bard, and Valen Art Academy, University of Gothenburg, the latest volume of which is Art and its Walls, Exhibitions, Institutions, and Art Becoming Public. He was previously a curator for modern and contemporary collections at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles. Hello, nice to see you both again. And I really want to thank you for making time, as I know it's really early for you, Alex, and I think it's after dinner, almost bedtime for you, John, on that side of the world. Of course, you're both not, no stranger to working across time zones with the way that you're working across the world in so many ways, which I'm sure we'll come to discuss in a way. It is also funny, actually, because while talking to Viet and Adriel on Monday, Alex and John, both your names came up repeatedly as we were reflecting on how we intersect across GACS, which is such a special space for bridging very different contexts of research and practice, and also alongside that for fostering friendships as well and new collaborations. So, and it makes me sort of slightly wistful as well, because thinking back to the last time we were together physically was actually back in 2019 in DC, because GACS brought us together there for one of its sessions. And it was just a really memorable time. I didn't realize how special it was when we were, actually I did realize how special it was because you taught me how to eat fish properly and cut tarot cards. But I didn't realize how, much I'd long for it because, of course, like the last 2 years, we've not all been able to travel and meet so easily. And so, I'm really grateful that via this project we have another opportunity to come together in the same room. So I'm thinking a lot about the work that you've done in relation to collaboration and partnerships of all different sorts across different places and cities across the world. And part of that is also linking to what I've read and research via the Noguchi archive, where I'm thinking about how he was an artist that was so open to different types of collaboration that was beyond his sort of conventional field, what you might expect from sculpture. One of the most well-known examples of Noguchi's collaborations was with Martha Graham, the choreographer and dancer, whom he encountered through his travels. And although initially I think Graham commissioned Noguchi to create 2 portraits, he went on to create set designs, and then even invented this sort of experimental stage object that was part of stage design and then became like a piece of costume which she would put on during her dance piece. And, I think others have reflected on their collaboration and noted that, both of them, although they were leaders in their field, refused to have their work be imprisoned by the expectations or the conventions of their genre, but explored through these kind of collaborative partnerships to bring about much more expansive, imaginative possibilities. And I'm also thinking in a way of like Noguchi's work, Challenger 7 Memorial, which is installed in Bayfront Park in Miami. Which is also, by the way, designed by Noguchi and Shoji Sadao, another Japanese-American architect and long-term collaborator of Noguchi's. I mean, I think about this work because it's so interesting because it's so monumental. It's a 100-foot high tetrahelix spiraling tower, and it's composed of these kind of 31 tetrahedrons. But how Noguchi got to even imagining this kind of project, it was because he was inspired by Buckminster Fuller's energetic synergetic geometry, I have to say that correctly, which kind of viewed the tetrahedron, a solid of having sort of 4 triangular sides as being a basic building block of the cosmos. So while in practice, although they were friends for, multiple decades, I think about 40 decades or more, their actual collaborations were either short-lived or did not come to fruition. This monumental work really owes the emergence of its ideas to Noguchi being inspired by Fuller's research and their long-standing friendship. So these kind of stories and examples really, I suppose, brought home to me how collaborations, can have definitive outcomes, but can also be born out of a long-standing relationship and relational dynamics between people that shape ideas, and open up other new ones. So here, maybe I'll hand over to you first, Alex, to respond with some initial thoughts on this, and then John to follow. And I look forward to us chatting at the end.
Thank you so much, Annie. I just wanted to thank you and John and all the organizers for this moment. And also, Annie, I was just reflecting on how you had invited me to be part of the correspondence between yourself and Adriel Lewis, who had spoken here just at the beginning of the week, right, to participate in the dispatches that is online and really kind of have this correspondence. And with Adriel and Viet's conversation, it was really a wonderful conversation. And I really loved how Viet was reminding us of moments in which community finds itself through not only coming together because of, celebration or things that are positive, but also grief, right? And to heal and also to build together, such as with Asian American art, which he was talking about, and also Asian diasporic art. And I was really appreciative of him when he talked about the NH Summer Institute that he was a part of, that Margot Machida and I helped to co-direct at NYU, the Re-envisioning American Art History, because I think a lot of meaningful friendships came out of that. And of course, that was the thematic of the event that you had, and also future collaborations and partnerships. And the participants, kind of had these little mini reunions at times, right, when we see each other. And also his remembering of curator Karen Higa, who I remember as being really supportive in terms of my earlier work and sharing her knowledge. I was also struck by Adriel's engagement when he talked about his time during the pandemic and his self-imposed separation in terms of staying safe and thinking about outreach to friends, reflecting on the time that Noguchi spent in internment camps, and also his letters that he had written from within to his friends, right? So I really like that this will be a conversation also with John and Annie, because of the way that dialogue is generative and brings about thoughts, right? And so I wanted to think through collaboration and the importance of others to what I guess what you call my practice and how I see care and collaboration manifest itself through the pandemic as well. And so I wanted to underline first just Viet and Adriel's talk a couple days ago, because person-to-person bonds, community, and dialogue are also really important to my work. Meanwhile, I really believe that collaboration and sharing thoughts is a generative process, and as Viet notes, generative and also healing. So being in conversation is so important to build things with others in terms of GACS, or that we've been mentioning, right? The Global Asia Pacific Art Exchange, for instance, which is a network of scholars and curators and artists and arts practitioners who've come together each year since 2013, first really on site at different cities. So it was really about the exchange and being together in person around the world, in Hong Kong, Canberra, Wollongong, Sydney, Shanghai, DC, New York, Tokyo, Honolulu, Buenos Aires, London, Berlin, Montreal, and it shifted online in 2020 when we were engaging with folks in Aotearoa, and then it was virtual last year, right, during the pandemic. And so each of these engagements is really beginning with conversations and learning through listening. And the exchange itself was meant to engage with what was happening regionally, but also bringing folks internationally into the dialogue to share with others what's happening and thinking together in terms of issues and ideas. So it's a space where people can come together, feel supported, have a space where people will listen openly and share ideas and research. And there's been challenges because you want it to be a space where people feel safe, that they can share, right? But it can be really intense at times too, because folks are speaking about things that normally perhaps they might not even share with their colleagues. So it becomes very emotional. And I always say that inevitably we cry at GACS, and it's not so much like sadness, although people actually cry at the end because, we are already missing each other, but that people tear up because, or become emotional because you're able to finally, speak openly or deeply about your work and your practice and your thoughts and really your ideas and your beliefs, right? And so it's important to have the space. And I think it's helpful to have the space with international folks who are interested in similar issues, but somehow a bit on the outside, right? So there's this ability to talk about issues that might be divisive, for example, or difficult issues within your community that, might also be similar things happening elsewhere. And so you can really talk and have support. And GACS was also working with Asian American art and Asian diasporic art and global Asias and people in the field, and mostly 10 years ago or so, it was really at the edge of the field, right? And so a lot of people felt kind of isolated. You might be the only person working on that for in your state or in your country, right? Like very few people were working on it in certain spaces, but then together, like internationally, when we came together, we're like, oh, actually, there are a lot of people that are interested in it. So it was supportive. So I was thinking about, as Annie, kind of jumping back to what Annie was saying in the introduction about Noguchi's collaboration with Martha Graham. And I've been talking to an artist from Trinidad, Catherine Chang, and she had mentioned that he was a great inspiration in his collaboration through his work with set design and costume design with Martha Graham was really great inspiration to her collaborative work with theater design as well. And also in terms of Carnival, where she is very well known as a designer and collaborator with Peter Minshall, and was, thinking about Carnival as contemporary art, and that Carnival is really dealing with these issues of the time, although it's not really seen as such, with the high-low art at times, right? So it was really important for her work also to be seen internationally. For example, she made a point to be abroad for many years at different residencies, at different art schools, and she worked in England, Italy, and the US, for example, and she showed her carnivore design for backtracks, which actually, Jackie wouldn't mind playing the video just so people can see it. There's no sound on this specific video, but just so you can see backtracks, which Catherine Chang designed, which was created so that it's actually, I don't know if you could play that. Is it playing? Just so you can see the movement of the costume. It's nice with the sail. Do I need to play that or? Okay. I don't seem to be able to play it unless I share the screen, I think. Here. Let me just quickly see if I can do that. Okay. I'm not sure if that's sharing right now. Okay. So you can see just some of her work, just so you have an idea of what it's like. So the work was actually created so it's modular, so she could pack it flat and actually have it travel with her in her suitcase. So she brought this to England. But what was important was that her work was seen as contemporary work, and that a carnival and those who worked in carnival design were a part of, the contemporary art scene and circulated internationally. I'm also thinking historically of Simple Atek and Carl Chang and their work in Trinidad in carnival design as well. So connecting with artists and thinkers and this sort of circulation of artists in the Caribbean, England, New York, etc. at that time as well. So I'm going to stop that. Okay. So thank you. And so in terms of collaborations internationally, it was really important for GACS to have had the Global Asia's Art Symposium with the Mori Art Museum when we were in Tokyo in 2015, and the University of Tokyo as well. And I remember at this time that many folks didn't know about Asian American art, and the term Asian diasporic art was also something less talked about, kind of still on the edge, as I was saying, of the field. And it became really important to be in dialogue in terms of the field internationally and to see Asian American art in a comparative way with Asian diasporic art and beyond, and also contextualized in the global art historic framework as being part of the contemporary art discussion. So I've worked a lot in building support networks, sharing networks, collaborative networks like the Diasporic Asian Art Network, the Climate Working Group, GACS, or Decolonizing Curatorial Museum Studies and Public Humanities Project, because I believe that together we have the brilliance of everyone, and we can combine resources, we support each other with ideas, space for thought, and we can learn from models from each other's work and experience. And we can work across institutions and disciplines, because Asian American art, climate change, global Asias are all interdisciplinary and enmeshed. And also these networks provide friendships, bonds, and the exchange brings people together, and friendships and collaborations from that form, not just like for a year, but like for years and careers and lifetimes, right? And so during the time of the pandemic, I've seen the need for these bonds and friendships and ties across the digital divide and across borders where we can't really travel so easily anymore. And so this has rekindled friendships and how one realizes the important moments when you're with certain people. Like Annie was saying, like when we had, dinner during GACS in DC together, or had different meetings when such and such happened, you went to an exhibition together or whatnot. So these bonds and friendships and collaborations last and build support. So, for example, I'm part of a book club now. For people that are too busy to be part of a book club, I hate book clubs, and I'm only part of it because my friend from kindergarten reached out during the pandemic to bring people together. And it has become an amazing space for thought and ideas and discussion during a challenging time. And I've also been fortunate to be kind of pulled into an amazing group of folks with the G11 artists. And it's been this amazing group in terms of dialogue and thought, and especially, thinking through like thoughts and issues during the pandemic in terms of anti-Asian violence, also globally and in the US, and also seeing folks come together to create masks, right? With the Auntie Sewing Squad, which was this volunteer group that grew to enormous size of over 800 members, but began with artists and networks of people who were working together before. So the networks were created, and so they could pull people in together, and then it just grew right from there. And so included organizers from the Asian American art community, like artist performer Christina Wong, who organized folks, and then Gail Issa, who was the former executive director at the Asian Arts Initiative, who also helped organize care for the group, which is amazing in itself, right? Folks donating things to each other, offering childcare, for instance. And so they grew and worked beyond, and their community as well. And so folks coalesce, right, and find community in duress in relation to traumas and shared experiences. So projects and building things in life is not lived alone, right? And I try to work in this in my teaching as well with collaborative classes, building student networks and collaborative projects, because the friends you make at school, I like to say, is sometimes your friends for life if you're so lucky, and your network coming out, right? So I'm going to just stop here for now because I've talked a lot, and I'm going to let John speak because I know we're going to have a conversation later as well.
Thanks, Alex. And I also want to second the thanks to Annie, and also to the Barbican for the opportunity to speak together on the occasion of Noguchi Conversations. And let's see if I can forward the slides. Okay, great. So basically, I'm going to be taking a somewhat kind of more historical view, but I wanted to start actually very autobiographically, I guess, which is with this work by Noguchi called Waterstone from 1987. It's the first piece by Noguchi I recall ever seeing that I was consciously like, okay, this is made by someone named Isamu Noguchi. I was a teenager at the time. I didn't really kind of know so much about different artists, but I think I knew about this piece and I saw it. It's on view in permanent installation at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And it was the first time I was in New York, and I went to the Met and I saw this piece in the Japanese galleries of the museum. And it was kind of like a great moment for me, just because like I think I literally, I think, walked across or up or something like Manhattan, and I was just kind of needing a little break, and this was like the perfect place for that. It's the piece, as you can kind of maybe guess, is really kind of plays off the balance and tension between water and stone. In other words, the stone is like perfectly still and also perfectly chiseled in some places and rough in others, but also like, the water is literally streaming out of the center of it and kind of flowing around all the sides of it. And so there's this kind of balance, but also a tension. And it was kind of great just to kind of have that moment of like stillness, I guess, movement, but stillness. But one of the things that I remembered from this, aside from it just being a great place to kind of like rest and kind of regather, was also there was a video that played not far away from the piece. And I remember watching it because, as you may be able to guess, from the image, the installation itself is rather kind of complicated. It requires, it's sitting not just in kind of on the floor, but also among a kind of a nest of stones. And it's really kind of, set very specifically and very precisely within the pavilion, right? And to get it there was kind of this topic of the video. I'm not going to show the video, but I'm just going to show you a still from it. And you can see from this, that even though the piece is called Waterstone and it's, attributed to Isamu Noguchi by himself, that in fact there was a whole crew of people who were responsible for installing it because it was so complicated. It's like a working fountain in the middle of a museum, right, which isn't supposed to have any kind of water running through it.
And so I was really kind of, the teenage me, I guess, was really impressed by this, and impressed enough that I remembered this video and actually dug it up because I hadn't seen it, I think, since that time. Anyway, but what you can see in this is kind of the participation of a whole group of people, the collaboration, in other words, of a single author piece, right? And Annie has already mentioned some of the individuals that Noguchi worked with, Martha Graham, for instance, but there was a whole kind of a crew of less well-known individuals, including Shoji Sadao, who was the architect, that Noguchi worked with for the installation of Waterstone, and also Masatoshi Izumi, who was kind of his who worked with him as part of his studio group for a good part of Noguchi's practice. And so what the video made clear was that, that even if the wall label says that, something is made by a single artist, it's not necessarily the way it actually gets made, and that, there's possibly a kind of a whole range of collaborations that make the work happen, make the work appear, right? And so that was kind of, something that I guess I thought about when I was invited to this conversation. I'm in Hong Kong and not able to see the exhibition, so I'm not sure what actually is there. But this was kind of something that I thought about, and especially as Noguchi himself was someone who was very much interested in working on a large scale and in public art often. Then, I think this the collaborative element of artistic making is something that was fairly common for him. But on the other hand, there's another way about thinking about collaboration, and I'm going to kind of switch gears a bit and talk about a different moving image piece, something a little more popular, which is a film called The Farewell that came out in 2019. It was directed by Lulu Wang and starred Awkwafina, and gathered some a fair amount of critical acclaim, but it wasn't actually until a couple of weekends ago that I saw this film. And if I'm bringing it up here, it's not because I happen to see it, but actually because in some ways, the whole conceit of the film is, and I'm hoping that I'm not spoiling it for anyone, but the kind of whole plot mechanism of the film revolves around a whole family of people who you see kind of all around the elderly matron in the middle here, who basically conspire to keep a secret from the grandmother, who's in the middle here, to Awkwafina's character here, because the matron actually has cancer, and rather than letting her find out, all of her children, all of her grandchildren, all of her extended family basically collaborate, essentially work together to keep this from her so that she can remain in the best of moods and live her life to its happiest moments, right? And the film has a lot of drama. It ends happily, in case anyone is hesitant to see it because they're afraid of kind of a sad ending. But I was really struck by the way that the movie kind of put into the tension of the film. The plot revolves around this kind of the tension between the individual and the group. And that kind of, touched on certain kind of themes and ideas that maybe are familiar to anyone, to people of Asian heritage, the idea that, like of putting the group ahead of the individual. But I think that, these ideas are also familiar, like from more commonplace ideas of like, or kind of recent news. So for instance, thinking about like the way that East Asia, for instance, Hong Kong or China or Korea has handled the pandemic, as opposed to kind of more individualistic societies like the United States or countries in Western Europe, right? But these ideas are also kind of things, the idea of putting the group ahead of the individual is maybe also something that is kind of a refrain or common in the idea of nation building in the post-war, post-colonial societies, right, in the world. And so, we can also think about, for instance, how, and here I'm going to be dipping into, my work at Asia Art Archive, thinking about, for instance, in post-partition India, there was the creation of an art school, the Fine Arts faculty at the University of Baroda, that was really about fashioning a kind of an Indian modernism that was kind of, distinct from the colonial forms of modernism that were inherited from the British, right? And that was a collaborative effort on the part of the faculty and the students, right? And so this idea of collaboration is something I think that is very, that runs deep in Asian societies, not just philosophically, but also historically. Now, this is not to say that it was unique to Asia, the idea of kind of this like group think or kind of like working together. Of course, this was something that was common in the United States itself, right? I mean, like one of the things about the kind of the legends or kind of ideas of the United States during the war was that, World War II was that it pulled itself together and really kind of worked in tandem, right? People worked together to kind of make sure that the United States kind of came through. But that was also kind of reflective of a certain kind of conformity, I think, that was part of U.S. society. And this reflected also in the way that Asian Americans experienced that society and continue to experience that society. And if I'm showing you this slide of images related to the artists Norman and Bruce Yonemoto, it's because the two brothers, not only are collaborators, they or were collaborators until Norman passed away about a decade ago, but also because in the work they explored this question, the tension between the Asian American individual and a white American society, and the way that there were certain forms of racism and exclusion that were experienced. And so what you see on the screen in the middle is a still from Green Card, An American Romance, which is a video, a film that they made exploring this kind of question of basically the way that melodrama embodies certain kinds of these conventions and social conventions, and the way that they can play out for Asian American characters, right? And then on the right side of the slide, you can see Environmental, which is a video installation that the two made, featuring 14 home movie screens that that basically caught the image of various World War II era Hollywood films in which Japanese American or Japanese characters were portrayed as villains, right? And so what they were kind of thinking about and kind of sharing with their audience is the representations of Japanese Americans during that moment. And this was really the kind of the moment that they grew up in, right? Because they came out of this moment when Japanese Americans, over 120,000 Japanese Americans were interned during World War II in concentration camps. And coming out of that, they grew up in a household, like many Japanese American households, where there was a kind of a total emphasis on assimilation, where they were never taught Japanese, even though their grandmothers spoke Japanese. They barely had any connection to Japanese culture because they really wanted to fit into white American culture as much as possible, right? So there was this kind of, tight latch on that, the expression of their Asian Americanness or their Japanese Americanness. This is something that I think, they really explored throughout the production. So you can see, from the earlier work to the later work, it's something that they continue to mine. And as I mentioned, Norman and Bruce worked together for much of the production. They also worked individually, but I think it's interesting that even though Bruce worked also separately from his brother, in much of his work, he also explores this kind of, the collaborative aspect or the dimension of his work. So you can see this, for instance, in North, South, East, West, which is a kind of a series of photographs that he produced, partly to emphasize the presence of Asian Americans, or the fact that there were Americans of Asians in America, let's say, from the 19th century forward. And in fact, there were, and you can see that, these particular sitters are in what looks like Civil War era uniforms, because in fact there were Asians serving during the Civil War, right? And so part of it is to kind of point out that invisibility or the invisibilization of Asians in American history. But part of this is also collaboration, and you may recognize the sitter on the right, who is actually Viet Le, who spoke just a couple of days ago as part of this series. And so this is kind of a recurring aspect of Bruce's work, the kind of collaboration with other artists, the collaboration with other people. And it's a mode of working, I think, that he's kind of really runs throughout his work, whether it's done with Norman or in solo, as it were, because he's constantly kind of working with other artists. And there's a kind of, I think, as Alex was mentioning, it's a way of dialoguing and a way of thinking as much as it is an actual kind of just something you do. But if this question of Asian Americanness and questions of identity is something that I think runs throughout Bruce and Norman's work, it's also because they were able to think of it together. Individually, they both experienced this idea of this growing up process that really emphasized their assimilation. But I think it was working together with one another that they were able to explore their Japanese Americanness, right? So in other words, to kind of really work through that and think through that and unearth that and kind of really make that part of the sharing that they have with their audiences. And it was also made possible by Bruce's experience as an undergraduate at Berkeley in the late 60s. And Berkeley, together with San Francisco State University, were the two campuses that were the center of the Third World Liberation Front, whereby there were students who basically staged strikes demanding basically ethnic study courses and really kind of drawing attention to the kind of the claims made by people of color and students of color for more recognition, for more academic representation. And so this was something that really kind of galvanized Bruce's own awareness of his identity as an American of color, right? And I'm showing you this slide because I think it underscores the fact that these kind of the Asian American consciousness wasn't developed in isolation. It was part of a larger movement, a collaborative movement, as it were, of African Americans, Chicano Americans, Native Americans, and Asian Americans, kind of all thinking about that moment in the 60s when I think that they really wanted to break out of a certain kind of conventionality, right? But also to kind of demand more recognition and equality. And I think that, this idea of solidarity and collaboration continues in the Asian American movement. And, another part, if Bruce came out of the Berkeley moment of the Third World Liberation Front, members of the Basement Workshop also had been in the Bay Area at that moment and carried, I think, some of that thinking in the founding of the Basement Workshop, which was an Asian American arts and cultural, but also activist organization founded in 1970 and in New York. And so what you see here is a group portrait of some of the members of the Basement Workshop here. And, the group functioned for about 15, 16 years from 1970 to 86 and before it dissolved. But it led to, other organizations that came in its wake, including Godzilla. And I think we'll be talking more, I'm sure we'll be talking more about this. This is something that I think Alex can say much more about than I can, but I do want to just kind of give a shout out to this recent book, this really kind of massive tome that was edited by Howie Chang, and it's available via primary information. But I just got a copy of it and I'm very, very excited about it. But yeah, so Godzilla is the Asian American Arts Network. And you can see, some of the founding members, Margot Machida here, for instance, and Ken Chu and Bing Lee were two of the others. And that led to other groups, or was also kind of involved with other groups like Epoxy Art Group and also Tomato Gray Group. Epoxy on the left you see here, Bing Lee was a member of that as well as Godzilla, and then also Tomato Gray, which is a group that advocates for greater recognition of artists from Hong Kong in the US. But if there's a kind of, kind of a practice, a collaborative practice among Asian American artists and kind of, in different groups, and the kind of the way that it's about banding together to kind of have greater support. I don't want to isolate this as part of just kind of the arts. I think, it's important to think about this kind of practice of working collaboratively and working in groups and working as part of a larger network. I think to find strength, but also to kind of, really think about the realm of possibility. And one of the things that, I'm interested in about Asian American collaboration specifically is that, Asian American identity is not in and of itself a given. I think like at the moment that Bruce and members of the Basement Workshop were kind of finding an Asian American identity, they had to really kind of create that because they had consciousness as Japanese Americans, or they had consciousness as Chinese Americans or Chinese immigrants, but not necessarily as Asian immigrants. And I think that it took a certain leap of imagination to kind of really craft or fashion an identity that's still in the making, right? And I think ultimately that's kind of one of the things I find really exciting about the collaborative work that Asian American cultural organizations do, is that it's about kind of fashioning something which the goal is not, in the words, necessarily pre-given, right? Or what exactly it is that brings everyone together is not entirely defined in the way that like being members of a family to kind of help lessen the worries of a family member is maybe a little more kind of specific, right? And I think there's something very kind of forward-looking about that. And I think that that is also part of a larger kind of thinking about collaboration. And here I'm showing you an image of the Milk Tea Alliance, which came into being a few years ago. I think in terms of as a way of connecting activist groups in Hong Kong and Taiwan and Thailand and other parts of Asia, right, and around the world. And I think that if we want to think about collaboration in the arts among Asians, among Asian Americans, I think we should also think about these larger forms of collaboration that I think they're plugged, that they're plugged into, and not think of it in isolation. Because I think to do so is to offer a richer understanding of that practice of that work. Just as in the same way that, when we look at Noguchi's Water Stone in isolation in the gallery, it's to think of it as one thing, and certainly we can appreciate the work. But when we understand the way that it was made as the process, as the outcome of a whole kind of group of people, I think it offers us a very different understanding. So maybe with that, I'm just going to stop there. And yeah, so looking forward to speaking.
Hi. Thank you so much, Alex and John, for that wonderful, informative presentations that you've just made, and also bringing in and raising actually certain thematics that I like to sort of pick up on in our conversation. But first, you also reminded me I also got my copy, which I dragged all the way back from Asia because it's really heavy. And actually, thank you, Howie. You sent me 3 copies. I don't know why, but thank you. So I'm really looking forward to reading that. And maybe if we start there, because I think you raised a really important point about identity not being something that, especially a kind of broader framing of Asian identity, not something that we come to naturally, but takes work and so on. And that sort of recalls me also like within Asia art activism, the coming together of various artists and curators and thinkers, but all from different cultural contexts as well, because within the network, it sort of stretches across folks that have Vietnamese heritage, people from South Korea, I'm from Singapore, and various peoples that have passed through. We have members who are Filipino, from Malaysia, and so on. So it sort of networks across, these different types of diasporas under this category of Asian, which is also very new to us to utilize here in the UK. Because for a long time now, I guess in the UK, when we use the term Asia, it tends usually to refer to South Asia, lesser so to Southeast and East Asia, although that's been sort of slowly changing in the last couple of years. But during the pandemic, there were also a few stories where I think a friend of mine who is South Korean was doing a school run, and then, dropping off her kid, was then confronted by someone, with regards to the pandemic, saying something quite racist and sort of inferring like go back to China, that sort of thing. And it is one of those moments when you sort of realize, and although you have these kind of different specificities, you might be viewed from the outside as being sort of very broadly Asian, and it doesn't matter what kind of Asian, which also brings to mind that moment, what happened in Asian American history with Victor Chin as well, right? Yeah, so that particular incident. So I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more about, I guess, your own understanding of how one comes to the idea of a community identity, and what are some of the, I suppose, what are some of the areas of which that can be generative or maybe difficult as well?
Maybe, okay, I'll just say something very quickly, and then I'll hand it over to Alex, because I'd like to hear what she has to say. I think maybe one kind of like a pithier way of kind of formulating what I was kind of grasping towards is, I think part of what I find really kind of interesting about Asian American identity is that it isn't a given. And it isn't the basis, that givenness isn't the basis of the solidarity, right? So in the way that like a family is like a kind of a given, like, oh, you're born into the family and you're part of the family, or like, oh, you're born a Chinese American, or you're born Chinese, or you're born something, right? You're not really born Asian American in that same way, in the way that, you understand. I mean, I think maybe now that generationally it's a little different, but I think like, at least at a certain moment in time, it wasn't a given, right? And part of the work of collaboration is about identifying or defining what the identity is, right? And I think that's kind of one of the things that I find very kind of appealing, exciting about it, is that it is about kind of like finding that or defining that, and that's part of the kind of the collaborative work.
No, that's really interesting. I might just jump in a little bit in terms of like thinking about Asian American identity and like the coalescing of that terminology. I think, which John also mentioned before, this notion of solidarity really is reflective of communities coming together, people coming together against racism. So I think at the root of it is racism. And so if you think about the Asian American art movement or the Asian American movement, really it comes really from the civil rights movement, right, in the 50s and later on in the 60s, Black Power movement, and really inspired by that. And so in terms of like the coalescing, it's really like to come against also racism, right? And that's something that we really see, I believe, now with different community groups coming together as well, really combating racism. And just thinking about GACs and other groups and arts practices that are also involved in decolonization, right? In relationship to that, in terms of like thinking about these systems of power that are causing erasures and invisibility, and really countering that as well. And at this moment, this is like a really important time for that. And I also wanted to think about like the Asian American art movement in terms of like that it's not just one thing that happened at one time in the 60s and 70s, but that it was like, I think I mentioned before with Arlen Juan, the artist, who was part of Basement Workshop as well as Godzilla, who said to me at one point that, everyone goes through their Asian American 101, and thinking about like different points of movements. In fact, I'm working on an exhibition at the Mori Art Museum with Manabu Yahagi right now on kind of these hubs in sites in which people coalesced. And for example, the Asian American Artists Collective and Project A within that, which was the Visual Arts Collective portion. But how, in Chicago, this happened, in the 90s and 2000s, and really was very much, a lot that was happening is very, of course, individual to the folks that were part of it, like Laura Kina, Larry Lee, Anita Yao Lee, in terms of like practice and whatnot. But the coalescing of these folks against, for example, 9/11, what was happening during that time, is reminiscent of, for example, Godzilla coming together during the 90s and really, pressing for visibility, but also being engaged in different things such as some of the folks were, protesting against police brutality against artists in the streets during that time, and especially in New York. And so, just thinking about how, for example, in Philadelphia, with I had mentioned before Gail Issa with the Auntie Sewing Squad and how she was part of that, but her working with many different people in Philadelphia as well, in terms of visibility, of course, of artists, but also thinking about in Philadelphia, there was this. A lot of times this happens in Chinatowns, but there's in the middle of the city, really this kind of roadway that was built and convention center that I kind of cut the city, and so kind of made certain areas like separated from others, but really kind of bringing attention to the need of like attention to certain areas or making placemaking at the time and that sort of thing. So I just wanted to think about that too, in which like this is happening constantly, and it's happening now, and while it was also happening during the civil rights movement and after in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting that how, I guess, different groups come together at certain points in history, and then there's a sort of life cycle of that group, and what they are able to do. And I suppose one of the things I did take away from the conversation earlier this week as well with Viet and Adriel was that even when the groups sort of come to their end of that sort of cycle, they sort of seed in some mycelial way the generation of other things that come after that. So there's a sort of, not necessarily to put an expectation that things should last forever, but they do sort of engender other things to come as well, which is a sort of more hopeful way of looking at when things do come to an end for whatever reason. I know that here in the UK, it's been sort of interesting actually, because I've been away for various reasons, but was sort of watching from afar and then hearing from afar, some efforts to respond, in terms of the Stop Asian Hate campaign, trying to bring different groups together to organize this demonstration. And I was kind of, because I was away, I wasn't able to participate, but we were, part of the kind of network that received the news and was sort of supposed to share it. But it had got to a point where, the event was organized and people were going to make speeches and doing different things. And then there was a bit of a fallout because something had gone wrong. And one of the leaders of the organization of the event was caught up in an alleged sort of sexual harassment situation. And so for that, different people pulled out and the entire demo was canceled. But what was also then a shame was that at that time I was working with a couple of community leaders for something else, and we had a discussion there, was that the fallout from the canceling of the event actually caused various organizations to be really annoyed with each other, so much so that when they were trying to organize these community workshops later on, people were actually communicating like not wanting to be in the same room, not wanting to have a conversation. So yeah, the fallout of community during a time when really solidarity might have been really necessary as well was one of the repercussions. So I think that there's something there about how coming together, like what you said earlier, Alex, that coming together, we're occupying more space. We share everyone's brilliance and resources, but coming together can also be risky because there are all these things that sort of come to light, and then how do people navigate through these kind of issues?
Yeah, I think that, one thing that I really appreciated about what Viet was saying on Monday was cautioning us, I think, to not over romanticize community. And I think that was a really important and valid point in terms of, we have this kind of idea that, oh, community is that warm and fuzzy place that we can go when we're feeling like overly commodified, or kind of like the capitalist world kind of oppressing us or something. But I think, it was very kind of good that he also reminded us that community is something that capitalism sells, right? And there's a form of community that is a very kind of commodified, kind of readily accessible one that maybe glosses over moments of tension and moments of, maybe less kind of the less friendly, happy moments, right? And yeah, I think that, that's the kind of, I think what you're saying kind of, is also a useful reminder that, it's not just all happy times, I guess, in the world of collaboration.
Well, that actually just reminded me. You did actually talk about the film in our pre-conversation. You said that you would, and I wasn't sure if you would, but I actually did watch the film after you brought it up because I was so hesitant, having read the blurb, thinking, "Oh, it's going to break my heart," But I'm so glad you encouraged me to watch it because, yeah, it was really, really interesting. Apart from her questionable accent, but the various kind of conversations having with her family members,
Yeah.
about why they would choose to make that effort. And I think that was that bit where you raised as well about who's carrying the weight of which, and I think that's also really interesting in terms of like thinking about cultural relations, whether a community can carry the weight for you or not, and so on. And I was just wondering whether, Alex, did you watch it in the end?
I haven't watched it yet. Sorry, it's the start of semester and I'm teaching 3 courses, but I will now that you both really recommended it.
Certainly the film also brought up certain scenes I loved, which was how karaoke also was a way to bring people together, because certainly at AA we were also talking about wanting to come together to sing again where we possibly can. But I suppose, sorry for the digression. I thought I should just mention it since John did talk about it. But I also wanted to talk, go back to some of the things that you've mentioned, like in ways that which collaboration and partnership, in sort of reaching across, as it were, outside of oneself's own specialisms, that allows for a more kind of expansive way of working that in turn, in a way, also kind of opens up the category in which they're working in, and I think about how necessary that is within art history as well, that, there are different perspectives, or in terms of scholarship. I think like the School of Baroda that you mentioned, John, where you had like multiple perspectives coming together. It was a collaboration between different expertise. So I was wondering also that, like, how necessary is that in the work that you do? And maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think that, I guess, Alex brought up the very important point that in some ways, if there was Asian American solidarity in the 1960s, it is as part of a larger civil rights movement, right? And as part of a response to racism and forms of oppression and basically symbolic and real violence, right? But it wasn't just that. It was also about the kind of the forging of a positive out of a negative. And in this sense, I think that, Asian American identity is somewhat similar to queer identities, right? In the sense that, it's taking something that, in maybe the larger culture or kind of the conventional culture is seen as, an epithet or a negative, right? Oh, you're X or you're Y or you're just this, right? But really kind of taking that and investing it with positive value and positive meaning, right? And one of the things that I think is really interesting is the kind of within a US context, or maybe now within a UK context, that, you know, there's a kind of like, let's say, a domestic kind of way of revaluing or refashioning these kinds of diasporic identities. But also, I think that that kind of reaching across borders and that transnational way of thinking is something that I think is happening within the Asia context as well. So, you know, I closed the kind of what I was talking about with the kind of a gesture towards the milk tea alliance, right? Because I think that's an instance of people who are in Thailand and in Taiwan and in Hong Kong kind of reaching across to one another. Because like in some ways they each have their own national kind of, you know, like dramas or their own kind of local kind of instances of struggle, but, you know, they're finding this solidarity across borders, right? And I think that that's really interesting. I think that there's a relationship, or kind of like there's a way to think about that kind of reaching across, and the reaching across that, you know, happens with the creation of Asian American identity and solidarity. And I think it's something that underlies Asia Art Archive, because, you know, even though, you know, like in some ways it's very obvious, like, you know, what Asia is, like, you know, from a European or American context, it's like that continent over there, which is huge and has billions of people, right? But like within Asia, people don't necessarily think of themselves as Asian. Like people think of themselves as like, you know, like Japanese or Chinese or Indian, or, you know, or Thai or Filipino. And thinking of oneself as Asian is something else, right? And I think that there are strategic economic reasons for it, like ASEAN, like Singapore, right? Like, you know, Southeast Asia, right? As an entity, there are strategic reasons for that. But I think that, you know, Asia Art Archive, this AAA, my AAA anyway, the Asia is there also as a kind of as a goal, as a kind of something to aim for, which is to think across these borders that separate these different countries, and to think about the flow between them, across them, through them, and in and out of them, right? And so I think in that sense, you know, it's really part of what we do is to kind of think optimistically, or kind of work optimistically towards something which isn't defined from the outside, but, you know, at the same time is kind of something that can be a collective or collaborative project.
Yeah, like I think that's really interesting in terms of like the coinage of the term, right? That, you know, people were even thinking like, what should we name ourselves? We're naming ourselves, right? So is it Amerasia, or is it Asian American? You know, and also thinking about Basement Workshop, and in 72 they came out with Yellow Pearl, which is this box set artist book, and, you know, each of the pieces are like a separate piece of paper, because it's supposed to be kind of like democratizing artwork that you could, you know, take it and put it on the wall. It was influenced by Grain of Sand, Yellow Pearl, Grain of Sand, Great Leap created this album, which was Nobuo Miyamoto and Chris Ujima and Charlie Chin, this trio that were folk singers that really kind of help coalesce ideas and whatnot within the movement through their songs. And so it was based off the songs. But within that volume, there were, you know, comics, there were like, you know, different types of visuals in terms of like rethinking the visual culture of Asians in America. So, for example, you know, the historic lineage of Asians in America visually oftentimes is very negative, right? In terms of stereotypes, you know, the lotus, you know, blossom, the Fu Manchu, or you know, the dragon lady, that sort of thing, and also, you know, yellow face, right? And so, and of course, that's coming out of, you know, centuries long racism, and but so thinking about, you know, instead, with artists such as Larry Hammer, who was part of this group, who actually changed, within comics, like the different color of like, facial features, not being like yellow or green at times, for Asians, but also, that within this this book were stories about everyday life, so it became like a space in which, again, it wasn't, stereotypes. It was like combating the stereotypes as well. And then really, as John was saying, like it was very positive in terms of claiming. Yeah. And also just to mention again, because I thought it was interesting how Annie, you mentioned that sometimes collaborations don't work. And John was saying like, it's not always the fuzzy picture, but just saying that, a lot of these groups, I mean, I know we talked about this before in terms of collaboration and how, John, you had mentioned like in East Asia, this idea of like coming together and like working together against the pandemic and, but instead, like thinking about these artist groups coming together, and it was much more messy, right? It wasn't about like, it wasn't so ordered. And at times you didn't know who was going to show up to meetings or be the spokesperson, or even what the actual mission of the group was, right? So there was this messiness to it. And then also divides within, people have different politics, right? So yeah, just to mention that.
Yeah, I suppose I do value the fact that when people do reach across, there's a sort of sharing of knowledge and experiences that is then, I suppose, expanding the perspective of whatever that is being discussed. My AAA had a panel event around the Milk Tea Alliance as well in 2020. And that was really interesting because although it was more of a closed event due to the particular political sensitivities, we had various activists that were then speaking about how, within the Milk Tea Alliance, there were also these ways that activists had found, sort of slightly off grid or under radar ways to share knowledge, ways to support each other across the border, and I found that really invigorating as well, that they're finding sort of Asian solidarities, and so creating other accesses other than the sort of rather overused East and West sort of divide. But certainly also, I think, having conversations, I mean, even thinking back to earlier on in this Noguchi Residences project, we had a conversation which had Ling Tianpo and Masi Kwan and Miku Maruyama. And it was really interesting trying to think about Noguchi and his work and the way it occupies public space and how the perspectives on that really differed, whether you were looking at it from the context of within Japan or looking at it in terms of like the transnational aspect of Noguchi's identity. So even those sort of differing perspectives, as nuanced as they were, opened up a much more complex view of who Noguchi was and how we are viewing his work. And I feel that complexity is something that can only happen in collaboration to some degree, and these partnerships and collaborations that work through that, whether it's coming together to make a publication on a specific moment of art history or making a project together, bring together skill sets and sensitivities that otherwise, are lesser explored. And there's something about that complexity that maybe messiness is another way to put it, that enriches the kind of artistic making process.
Yeah, I think that that's part of the interest of it, is that it's not just a kind of goal oriented in the sense like, okay, we're trying to produce this thing, that like, in the way that like, in the farewell, just to kind of go back to the film, since, it's like about like, kind of like, we have to do all of us have to work together to kind of like, maintain the secret, right, around this person, right? Or we have to produce this, exhibition, or we have to produce this publication or whatever. That's relatively straightforward. I mean, not that it doesn't have its own complications, as the film does kind of make clear, but like in some ways, at least, like, okay, what you can and can't do most of the time, right? But like, I think when it's something less kind of clear what the end is, but you're working with people towards it, then that's where I think, there's, it requires you, it forces the people involved in the collaboration to kind of really kind of like have to work through that, right? And I think that's something that I think people maybe don't like or kind of shy away from, because like, it's like we tend to be, well-behaved and polite people who want to avoid conflict. And sometimes, conflict can lead to inspiration, or it can lead to kind of creativity, right? There's like a certain kind of like, not that, we need it all the time, but like there is a certain, I guess maybe a kind of not antagonism, but just agonistic relationship that maybe can be productive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting to think of how, different artist groups and collaborators have, for example, taken certain issues and really engaged upon those issues. I know we had talked about before how, artists' solo work, and John showing the Yonemoto's work, how the solo work differed very much from the collaborative work. And thinking about, for example, epoxy, I think you mentioned, John, right? And how their work, their solo is very different than what came out with their the process and everything, like and the thematics of their collective work, and also Tomato Gray as well, right? Different engagements that they've had in terms of identity, right? That they're questioning and thinking about Hong Kong identity together, but that might not be something that in their solo work that they're involved in.
Yeah, I think it also makes me think of friction, I suppose, that friction isn't necessarily negative. It can kind of create interesting energies, isn't it? Where, I suppose that's also thinking about how we might navigate that within collaborations and partnerships. And that actually, for me, I think I do find it very exciting when a group of people decide to collaborate on something for which the outcome is not yet defined, and certainly, we've had various conversations. I mean, John, myself, in Asia Forum, but also with you, Alex, when we've participated in GACS, like those kind of moments when we're exploring like what could be done, and then being very open to like ideas and expertise outside your own sort of familiar comfort zone. And that sort of actually, from which emerges something completely like unexpected. I think that's really exciting in some ways. And I was just wondering also then, I think you made reference to the water stone sculpture. And I thought that was really evocative of also how in some way in the art world, there is a kind of mythologizing of like the singular artist, and a kind of erasure of everything behind it that allows that to be valorized, right? And so even when we were speaking about institution, the number of people behind the scenes to make the cogs work, as it were, within the institution, and how in some ways why there is a hierarchy of what is seen and appreciated and what is also unseen and underappreciated. And in some way, I think that also makes us think that, is there something more to be said about the working structures of institutions as well that need to have much more of that collaborative, collective spirit rather than a more kind of hierarchical, this is your role, and, these are the people that are being highlighted and so on.
Yeah. Maybe like, one thing that kind of occurred to me when I was kind of thinking about whether or not to discuss that Waterstone was kind of how we think about collaboration and how we think about partnership. And one thing to note is that, like, I think in common parlance, like when we say, oh, they're collaborators or they're, or they're partners, there's a kind of the assumption of equality between them, or in terms of like, everyone is equally visible, everyone is equally acknowledged. But that's not always the case, right? I mean, if we think about, for instance, Shoji Sadao, who worked and collaborated with Noguchi on many projects over both of their careers. He was in some ways the co-designer of many things, the kind of creator of many things, but he's not, his name is not part of that wall label, his name is not kind of acknowledged as being like, the co-inventor of this or the co-creator of that, right? He wasn't necessarily looking for that though, so I think that, part of do we call that still a collaboration? Do we call that, kind of a silent partnership? What do we call that, right? And I think it takes a lot to make the world run. And I think in the world that we live in, unfortunately, we tend to kind of like forget that, or we kind of overly celebrate, individual makers, individual creators, whether it's like in the art world, where we like, valorize artists and we valorize curators, but we tend to forget that there's a registrar, or there's various like hundreds of people in it working in an institution to make it work, right? And make everything function, and kind of the lights turn on and the doors open and close, and everything is there running, right? And that also is a kind of there's a cooperation, if not a collaboration, and like, how do we think about that, right?
I think like this idea of invisible labor is really important on so many different levels, like definitely the institution and what John is saying, and how, an exhibition happens with such a huge team that many people will never know who worked on, right, the exhibition. And also like thinking about collaborative practices in terms of like artist groups, there's also invisible labor there. And thinking about a PhD student from Rutgers, who is a student of mine, just curated this wonderful exhibition online for the Virtual Asian American Art Museum on Basement Workshop, and about mutual aid and reciprocity, and really how, Fei Chang, the director there, she never took any pay, until later on she started writing grants and stuff and really started paying people. But, I remember she told me like her pants were $1, that she would go out to like the really inexpensive places, and so there's like that as well in terms of burnout, right? I was just thinking about, an artist who was working in London, actually, with some issues with, organization, an Asian organization that, folks were protesting at the time. But, folks putting in all that labor in terms of the protests, right? And, coming up with research and, presentations, all sorts of things, and that, you're not being paid for, but how are you being paid, right? Because then, as John is saying, is like, you want to do this, right? But then there's that balance, right? Because with the Aunties Sewing Squad, for example, that I mentioned before, they stopped their work. If you can read on their website on Facebook, actually, they did so much work. It's unbelievable. I think just like quickly, I think they had 350,000 masks sewn and distributed, 8 relief vehicles to the Navajo Nation, like winter clothing drives, all sorts of things. But they had to stop, right? At a moment, they're like, we are not getting paid to do this, and we all have our solo careers and whatnot.
Yeah. But it was also coming at a moment of need, right? It was a moment, that was found at a moment when people couldn't get masks. Yes. And they were filling that need for, specific community, especially specific communities that were in need of that. And I think like once that, like the need maybe shifted elsewhere, then, exactly. That was, yeah.
Mm. Actually, it was really interesting when I was doing a bit of research. It turns out that Shoji Sadao is a Capricorn.
That kind of research.
Yeah, that kind of research. And Buckminster Fuller is Cancer, so it's really funny because Cancers and Scorpios are supposed to like get on like a house on fire, and both are kind of like big personalities and expressive. And then you've got the faithful Capricorn plugging away and doing a lot of the hard work. So I thought that was really funny because I was like, because I don't, I find it all very amusing, although I don't sort of put it 100% score on that, but I just kind of thought, oh, okay, this is sort of interesting. Kind of aligns with like what we're told of what their personalities are like. Yeah. But speaking of also exactly what you raised about invisible labor, I think it's really important in terms of thinking about sustainability, isn't it? Because there is a lot in community work as well as in activism, where in some ways we're sort of conditioned to think that we ought to be working for free, or that we should be working for less money because it's for a good cause. And so sometimes that almost becomes overwhelming, because you have so many requests for certain things that you're supposed to do because it's good for the wider community. But how much can you do, and how much can you sustain that? Because it's a good way that a friend of mine framed it. She said, "What is representation if it's exploitation?" Because that's another way that like we tend to kind of self-exploit, for this larger good cause, which I don't think in the end is sustainable. Maybe not that. That's a request for a kind of redistribution of resources for the work that we think we should do, rather than doing invisible labor. But I thought, we're kind of almost running out of time, and I wanted to close on a more kind of positive note. Like, if you could sort of share, I guess, in terms of collaboration and partnership, looking ahead of this year and the next, what do you think for you personally, like, excites you most about the possibility of collaborating?
You have anything, Alex, or you want me to go first, or?
You can go first if you want. Yeah, feel free.
Okay. Well, I think I'm very excited by the possibility, or the kind of the future GACs that I guess is still in development. So I think, Alex, I owe you an email about this to discuss. So that's one thing. But at AA, one thing that I'm actually very much looking forward to is there are two projects that AA is involved with. One of them is Art Schools of Asia, which is a kind of a ongoing seminar series, but also will become a symposium in the summer. And that's working with a group of emerging scholars who are looking at different kind of schools and kind of thinking, I think, about this question of education and learning and teaching, and the way that, that kind of, basically kind of runs throughout the art histories of Asia, and kind of the way that these kind of hubs and nodes of collaboration, right, are kind of crucial for thinking about the art histories of Asia. So that's one thing. And then the other thing that AA is involved with is the upcoming Documenta 15, and we've been selected as one of the kind of the organizations that's involved in the exhibition. And the whole kind of notion of the kind of the theme is, and principle of this Documenta, which is directed by the Indonesian group Rangrupa, is of course lumbung, and the idea of like sharing of resources. And so I think we're all being encouraged, all of the participants are being encouraged to kind of think collaboratively and working together. So I think that that's kind of a very maybe appropriate kind of projects, or both of those projects are appropriate to bring up in this kind of in this forum here. So as well as GACs.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm really looking forward to GACs too, and seeing what shape it will turn out to be. Because of the pandemic, we're always kind of like shifting back and forth and not totally certain. But we've been in conversation with artist Yuki Kohara and curator Natalie King from the New Zealand Pavilion over at Venice, and they're really helping to bring together Pacific Arts Association, the First Nations curators, and GACs, and to be in conversation. So that'll be very exciting. But also, like, the Decolonizing Curatorial Museum Studies and Public Humanities project that we're all also part of is really kind of started moving. So I'm excited. And Terra Foundation has lovely supported us for that. So I'm really excited about that as it progresses. And also the Mori exhibition, really, because it's being curated. I mean, it's Manabu and myself, but then it's like also like many different people, Larry Lee, like Howie Chen. It's like so many, Christina Ong, who's a PhD student, Yvonne Fong, who's the digital humanities curator type of person. So all these people coming together, they're already working on, Asian American archives, art and archives, so it's a huge collaboration. As we were talking about, the exhibition is a huge collaboration.
It sounds great. When is it open?
Yeah. Well,
June
thank you so
29th.
much, John and Alex. You know, for sharing this time. It's always such a pleasure to be in conversation with you. Yeah. I think there's a bit of a lag. I'm not sure if
slightly international here. Thank you, both of you, and for all the organizing that you did.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. It's great to see you.
I just want to double check. Is there a lag right now? Like,
yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I think I see. Yeah, I think the for some reason the internet is just yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. So sorry, does it seem to be a Oh, you can hear me? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for being in conversation. I just also want to make sure that, say thank you to the Barbican, to Ollie and Jack, who are helping me solve this lag problem behind the situation. But also for those who have not had a chance to see the Noguchi exhibition, it's on till Sunday. Please, you still have a few days. It's really brilliant. Do go down and see it. The digital residency also concludes this week. So, but it'll be online. So please do check it out if you haven't had a chance to. And this conversation will also be recorded and available via YouTube alongside the earlier conversation with Viet Le and Adriel Lewis. So thank you very much. See you all soon again.
Thank you, Annie.
Thanks.